All right, look, if you really want to talk about U.S. foreign policy in the Middle East, if you really want to discuss the foreign policy of Donald Trump and actually really the foreign policy of the past while or so, you really can't do that without talking about a particular country. And I think we all know which one. I think we can all understand that if you want to learn about modern U.S. foreign policy, you can do so by talking about this country, and especially the dynamics during the Trump administration in this relatively small country in the Middle East. You know, we grow up hearing about it all the time. Apparently, they're always having problems. Apparently, we're supposed to care a lot about those problems. And I am, of course, talking about the country of Syria. So if you've been following the news, If you've been following the news, you know the Assad government in Syria has officially collapsed after almost 15 years of the Syrian civil war, which began in 2011. And this is a problem because Assad was wrestling to maintain stability in the country, which meant relative safety, stability, and security for the Christian populations, since the Assad regime was fighting against these militant Islamic groups, ISIS, of course, included. And the NeoCons are very happy about this. They are celebrating because they've wanted the Assad regime gone since literally its inception. That was the official position of the United States government, and it remained that way until Donald Trump came into office. And so it's actually not an exaggeration to say that Assad remained in power for as long as he did because of the election of Donald Trump, which the media gave him hell for because it was Trump's gift to Moscow, because the Russians were also fighting to maintain the Assad government in Syria against these like insane terrorist groups. And so Trump, of course, did this because his foreign policy attitudes are completely antithetical to neoconservatism, which believes in nation building and exporting liberal democracy as like this grand ambition for the United States to undertake in the 21st century. Whereas Trump just believes in putting America first, which actually has like nothing to do with these other countries. And so these things are, of course, at odds with each other. And thankfully, in his first administration, he was actually able to successfully wrestle against these people, against this foreign policy establishment, to deliver on his promises to the American public. And now you look at what happens when he's out of office. We've got tensions escalating everywhere. I mean, Russia, Ukraine, Israel, Palestine, China, Taiwan. Yeah, this is your post-Trump foreign policy, sir. Like everything just goes back to business as usual. The world becomes less safe and more unstable. You pay for all of it to happen. You receive no benefits, no dividends. And because people will give the benefit of the doubt to anybody but the man who took a bullet for them, there's been a lot of talk. We're dealing with young memories here from people who basically don't know what a Trump foreign policy looks like or how it's different from anything else that's been going on. So they've been calling him a neocon. And so I had this giant video planned that was going to cover the current state of the world going into the second Trump administration, how the first Trump administration actually operated against the interests of the foreign policy establishment to deliver on all of its promises to the American public, which it did, what the foreign policy attitudes were like prior to the presidential campaign of Donald Trump in 2016. So today, we're pretty much going to focus on the latter. But we'll probably come back to the other stuff because it's very important. And the reason it's important is because people will just like repeat this platitude like, oh, you know, Trump didn't start any new wars. And it's like, that's true. Absolutely. It's worth repeating, but that doesn't really paint the full picture. It's like, hey, at least he didn't do anything really bad. Good for him. But his record is actually far more impressive than that. It's an important record because he managed to single-handedly realign the political establishment. And in particular, he successfully wrestled against the foreign policy establishment throughout his first administration. So you got to give him credit for that. So this is going to be a shorter history focused on that realignment, and then we'll do a longer history probably of all those other things at some point. So for now, we're not going to wind the clocks back too far. For the purpose of this discussion, we're going to be picking up from the trajectory that things were already on going into the 2016 election, how Trump managed to completely unroot and realign things away from the neocons and for the benefit of the American patriot class. You know, I remember taking the political compass test a few years ago, and people saw that I landed in the top right section, like the blue one, and they were like, I didn't know Doyle was a neocon. Yeah, because I'm not, you stupid idiot. But you don't understand. You're a stupid person. So you don't understand anything. You don't know how the world works. It's just like a dice roll every time for you. You could never purposefully understand something. If you do, it's by sheer accident. Anyway. People think neocon, I'm not going to crash out. People think neocon means using the military to do literally anything at any point ever, instead of like to identify the specific group of Trotskyists who sought to undermine and subvert the old right and capture the foreign policy establishment for the benefit of the Israeli state and for the proliferation of these democracy, nation building projects. And so Jewish migration to conservatism began in the late 60s and 70s because they were alienated and actually surprised by the anti-Zionism of the New Left. And so they largely became the neoconservatives. And this exodus was led, of course, by Irving Kristol Kristol, father of Never Trumper Bill Kristol, the colloquial godfather of neoconservatism. And it's important to mention that these people were Trotskyists because it may make you feel a little bit more grounded knowing that this pattern of people who are fundamentally of the left coming over and subverting the right because they thought that maybe the left was taking things a little bit too far without actually disagreeing with it philosophically at its core. Yeah, that's been going on forever. So while these guys may have disagreed with like the economics of leftism, they of course retain the core of it, this like blank slate, moral universalism, all of which justifies their desire to use the United States government to install open, free, democratic societies all throughout the world as their grand ambition. Now, believe it or not, I actually think that our in-depth discussion of neoconservatism itself will fit better in our perpetually imminent history of conservative cancel culture video, since they were the ones doing the canceling. But for now, since it was more or less responsible for the cards Trump was dealt upon his first inauguration, we'll summarize briefly by saying that obviously it is impossible to discuss neoconservatism without discussing Israeli interests. But it's also true that people who think that neoconservatism amounts to nothing more than just like being pro-Israel are politically illiterate. I mean, some of the most prolific neocons ever have been these huge never Trumpers, which makes sense because while Trump is pro-Israel, he's not a neocon. These are compatible. He hates neocons. He always has. They hate him, even though he's been described as the most pro-Israel president ever. And the Israelis love him, yet he still actually manages to go against Israeli interests while he's in office, particularly concerning Syria, like we said. And we'll discuss that more as the news cycle impetus behind this kind of unravels. But we should just clarify that because Trump broke free from these foreign policy orthodoxies and because Trump isn't a neocon, they hate him. Paul Wolfowitz attacks Trump. John Podhoretz, Bill Kristol, these people attack Trump. Robert Kagan, another huge neocon, he leaves the Republican Party, becomes an independent after 2016. His wife, Victoria Nuland, she was the undersecretary for state for political affairs under Biden, which is like the fourth highest ranking position at the State Department. So while the neocons historically have cared about Israel, they also historically value international liberalism and nation building. Like if all they cared about was Israel, then why are they so rabidly against Trump, who some have claimed is the most pro-Israel president in American history? Trump especially likes to claim this, and he says that all the time. But you get these like amusing anecdotes where Bill Kristol, of course, son of Irving Kristol, the godfather of neoconservatism, and who used to be a big and important player before Trump came along, and then he'll like go after Benjamin Netanyahu and attack him and complain about him. If there's someone more of a Zionist than Benjamin Netanyahu, I haven't heard of him. So spreading democracy, nation building, etc., these quintessentially neoconservative goals are liberal in nature, of course, because they're rooted in the idea that liberal democracy is the best form of government for all people in all ages, and that all people are fundamentally interchangeable. And Trump rejects this, and his whole perspective is rejecting that in terms of foreign policy and immigration policy, and that's why they hate him. His view of foreign policy and immigration policy are both downstream from that understanding, which is that, okay, this is not the natural state of the world. We can't just install this into any person and have our form of government be over there, but we also can't just install those people into our country and pretend that our system will function with that new class of people in it. So it's perfectly coherent. And that is, of course, exactly opposite to what neoconservatism believes. So yeah. Last thing, too, what people call the neocons, that was like 25 people. Isn't that inspiring? That could be you. You could form high-quality networks of people, use the empire as a vehicle for your will, for your political project, as so many other groups of men have done throughout the history of the world. But people just want to complain online. To each their own. All of this to say, Trump has succeeded where Ron Paul did not, all due respect, of course, because he's not ideologically opposed to military force. He's just skeptical of it being used as a tool for cultural expansionism, just as the American people are skeptical of that, and neocons obviously are not. They're enthusiastic about that. So Trump's foreign policy was a very successful peace through strength model, where he's not against using the military, but he also doesn't believe in using it for these projects beyond the national interest, which of course is unprecedented for us in the modern era. And you don't actually want other countries to think that you're like ideologically committed to being anti-war, because that just means you're weak. Like they're not going to read the theory behind it. They don't care. That's why Trump hired people like John Bolton, who never met a war he didn't like, simply to portray that strength and that ability to like take it there if that's what these other people wanted to do. So yeah, I'm not anti-war. I'm not pro-war. I'm not looking for fights, but we also can't lie to ourselves. I saw a montage of footage from the Vietnam War with Welcome to the Jungle playing in the background a few months ago. I'll tell you what, that was the proudest I've been to be an American in quite some time. We can't let the sentiment against these particular conflicts be co-opted by the anti-war people, War is actually awesome and cool. The problem is that these wars serve no purpose for us. But say if Greg Abbott decided to claim his place in history by reestablishing the Texas Army to militarize the southern border, execute mass deportation operations throughout the state, basically dare the feds to do something about it, I and virtually every other guy I know would enlist overnight. There's nothing wrong with war. War is something that we happen to like uniquely excel at, actually, so I'm not going to apologize for history. We're really good at a lot of things, but we're the best at a few things in particular. War is one of those things. The point of all this is like, it just has to be for us. Take the oil. That's what Trump said. We didn't even take the oil. Nonsense. You can't do it. So yeah, it's a matter of fact that Trump disrupted these Republican Party orthodoxies, which really is to say these establishment orthodoxies, because as I'm sure we all know, it is the job of the Republican Party to put up basically this big welcome sign, this big enter through this door sign for the money, political support, and enthusiasm of American patriots so that all of that can just be like vaporized and prevented from doing anything to stop the destruction of our civilization. And if you think about the things which historically would have been the Achilles heel of great nations, it's been the types of fires that we've tried to play with, massive debt, pointless wars, all of these things weaken great nations. So our foreign policy should have been focused on China, but instead, to the delight of the Chinese, we've spent on like decades of our time and trillions of dollars on these nation-building projects in the Middle East. We have nothing to show for it. We should have been normalizing with Russia against China in the aftermath of the Cold War, but instead we've pushed them into the arms of Beijing when they so obviously are more compatible with the West than they are with the Chinese. But in any case, yes, Trump disrupted these orthodoxies on immigration, on trade, and on foreign policy, which is primarily what we will be focusing on here. And when people think of U.S. foreign policy, typically they're thinking about the forever wars, the sand wars, the wars in the Middle East, which we never should have been involved with, which we're involved in for reasons that no one can even remember. So for 4 years under Donald Trump, America's foreign policy in the Middle East did away with all this like incessant moral pontification about human rights and democracy, which plagued every conversation during the Bush years and the Obama years. And it instead was able to actually focus on achievable goals, which were in the interest of the American public. And that's, of course, something that's new to the foreign policy establishment, which is why after John Bolton was fired by Trump, John Bolton, of course, being like a sort of arch neocon character, DC swamp creature. He goes on to write articles saying that Donald Trump's foreign policy was nakedly transactional. Everything is thought of in like very narrow terms. We give you this, we get what, and that he has the attention span of a, quote, fruit fly. Brother, this is the art of the deal. I don't know what you thought this was. We make deals here, okay? This isn't your daddy's foreign policy, and it's exactly why Trump had the most successful foreign policy of any president in decades. That thinking, I don't know what that thinking is, but he put it to work for the interest of the American public, damn it. Especially in regards to the Middle East. And here's the fun part. We as Americans actually have license to disregard any long-term effects because the only interest that Americans have in the Middle East is to not be involved over there, like bottom line. So it's not our problem. But okay, let's wind the clocks back. What is it that Donald Trump actually disrupted? Essentially, in the 2000s, your level of republicanism was determined by how outspokenly in favor of the Middle East wars you were. The more outspokenly in favor, the more Republican you were, the more of a team player you were. And you could ornament this with, appeals to family values and the Second Amendment. You got to play the hits. But before Donald Trump, your commitment to conservatism was defined by how in favor of these wars you were. And to attack Trump, to compete for the Republican Party nomination, people would try to flank Trump from the right on the permissible issues, but they would never touch any of the impermissible issues. It's easy to be Billy Badass on the debate stage when you've got your donors behind you and the only people mad at you are feminists and atheists and libtards. But all of a sudden that courage becomes absent when it comes to actually reaching for the top shelf, actually touching the issues which you're not allowed to touch. And you'll notice the remnants of the neocon swamp class. They do this to Trump still today. They try to attack him from the right, to discredit him, to hurt him. They say Trump has New York values. He's not a real conservative. Conservatives conserve things. Trump has done that. I don't know what that makes you people. But so you had to support the wars. And the other side of that coin is that if you expressed skepticism, not even opposition, just skepticism towards the wars, you're off the team. People lost their jobs from conservative publications for this. David Frum, who wasn't even an American citizen until like 2007, the year of Spider-Man 3, famously wrote this article saying that if you're not in favor of the wars, then you're unpatriotic. This was the attitude. And remember, this is before the internet really took off. And so the power in the movement was a lot more centralized behind these publications and these companies. And so it was a lot easier to cancel somebody, to just pull the rug out from under them and have them be just basically cast into the dustbin of movement history. And they spoke about these things in moral terms the same way that we would speak about theft or lying, as though it's just like self-evident, self-justice. I don't have to explain it. And they still do this, but they never believed that our involvement had to be qualified with any sort of explanation. It was just a given. Like, we must nation build. We must spread freedom if you're wearing a red tie. We must spread democracy if you're wearing a blue tie. It's all the same thing. The logistics may be debated, but the goal is obvious and imperative. George Bush literally had promoting freaking democracy and human rights as a stated goal of U.S. foreign policy, which of course means being the world police, being in the sand wars, and that's that. This was the GOP. They took the greatest amount of unity and political capital that our country has ever given or will ever give again to Republicans, that post 9/11 approval rating, and they spent it on tax cuts, wars for nothing, and the construction of a national security apparatus, which eventually would be used to target the very people who elected them in the first place. We got nothing. Bad deal. But that was the GOP. That's why it was so absolutely insane when Trump said to Jeb Bush, who was supposed to be the nominee. Everybody thought after Trump announced, Trump's an unserious candidate, he's going to fizzle out, and then it's just going to be Jeb Bush versus Hillary Clinton, another Bush versus another Clinton. Remember, people forget this because the Trump victory now, it's so obviously inevitable. It's his destiny. So we think about it as if back then it was so obvious. But a month into it, Jeb Bush was at 22%. Trump was at 1%. He was in 13th place. And he gets up on a debate stage. At this point, he's polling around 29% in a contest still with about 10 people. And he says to Jeb Bush during this debate that the war in Iraq was a big fat mistake. He says, we never should have been in Iraq. They lied. They said there were weapons of mass destruction. There were none, and they knew there were none. And then he tells Jeb Bush that the World Trade Center came down under his brother. Like, you have to understand, I mean, obviously Trump has a very personal connection to 9/11. He loves New York City. He's lived there his whole life. He loves skyscrapers. He loves building. That happens. He's immediately on the ground. He's putting his guys to work. I mean, I remember watching that and my jaw like literally dropped when he said that. February 13th, 2016. And he was booed for this by the audience, all the GOP operatives, the donors. People were just dragging him through the mud all throughout the media for saying this. But fast forward now, years later, when discussing these conflicts, the average opinion, like the median GOP attitude is, okay, well, what does that have to do with us? That's actually even the predominant attitude, probably, and that's because of Donald Trump, and only Donald Trump. And people like to say, well, winning elections doesn't matter. I mean, it kind of matters. It doesn't not matter, right? Like when your political project wins the White House, all of a sudden, it's difficult to continue gatekeeping everyone who's tried to right our ship, because you want to keep your job as like this, faux opposition operative. The dams kind of start to break, don't they? Anything can be normal if it wins the White House. And it just so happens that this political project, American nationalism, is a historic attitude which has been subverted by a hostile establishment, and we are simply restoring it. Before Trump, you couldn't criticize these things. You couldn't expect to win elections unless you supported these things, and you were on retainer to hold the same attitude towards any new conflict that may arise. After Trump, that's no longer the case, and you're actually rewarded for putting America first. That's something new. That's a Trump invention. Typically, the rewards are in the opposite direction. But now the shoe's on the other foot, and you face consequences for being a neocon. It's like a pejorative now, which is why those who have survived this have done so only by camouflaging themselves. But all things considered, it would be difficult to think of a more radical statement to come out of someone's mouth during a GOP debate for the Republican nomination to Jeb Bush. It's not the most memorable line. It's not the most viral. It is one of the most incredible statements to ever have been made by an American presidential candidate. I mean, when you understand the context and the dynamics of the time, and what was the result? His poll numbers just went up, which is so funny because like with everything else they were throwing at Trump, this was meant to sink him. I mean, you go back, you watch the gotcha questions against Trump in those debates. It's over things he said 20 years ago, which now are the predominant attitudes of the party. And that's been a very positive change. Questions like, you said George Bush lied to get us into Iraq and he should have been impeached for it. Well, what did you mean by that? Trump attacked George Bush. See, he's not a real Republican. Vote for me. I'm Chungus Moral Man number 7. No, now in 2024, there's not a single person who, if someone said something mean about George Bush, except for like maybe the Democrats who forget that Bush used to be literally Hitler or whatever, a freaking war criminal or whatever, now nobody cares. I mean, libtard historiography is literally like Bush is evil because he was being puppeteered by Dick Cheney. They make movies about this telling of the Bush administration. Now they bring the Cheneys out to campaign for them. And I'm not pointing out the hypocrisy. I don't hold these people to a standard. I'm not doing that. I'm pointing this out to justify that I don't think they're even real people. So yes, but even if you look at what prompted Trump to say that the towers came down under George Bush, it was Jeb Bush saying that, well, Trump was building a reality television show. My brother was building a national security apparatus to keep us safe. Wow, bro, victory royale achieved. You mean the national security apparatus that is now being weaponized against American patriots, the same patriots who probably voted for your stupid brother in the first place? Have you had anything to say about that? No. So who cares? He wants to be a tough guy. He wants to be president, and it doesn't work very well with him. All of this to say, These words being said by Trump in 2016 were some of his most radical. People forget this. Because at the time, for a Republican presidential candidate to say that we shouldn't have been involved in Iraq and to criticize George Bush by name to his brother, the expected nominee, that would have been a political suicide act by anybody else. Nobody else on that debate stage could have gotten away with this, and they certainly would not have dared to. And yet, on this issue, like with so many other issues, Trump just gave the silent majority who have long been dissatisfied with the way things are going a voice for the first time in their own party. And it's been over 8 years since this debate, and now criticism of the Iraq war, wars in the Middle East in general, opposition to neoconservatism, that's all mainstream on the right. NeoCon is now used as an insult all of the time. And there are remnants, of course. You've got chameleons, but they're fewer by the year. And we have Trump to thank for that. But as a consequence of how long ago this change occurred, even if only 7 years ago within the last decade, people have become accustomed to this being the new normal, and they're forgetting how bad it used to be. And they're forgetting who it was that moved the ball in the right direction in the first place. And at the end of the day, these are just Trump's lifelong attitudes about foreign policy. I mean, everything he said at that debate on the campaign trail during that election cycle, it's consistent with what he's been saying for his entire life. America comes first. Our leaders are stupid. We can't get ripped off anymore. We have to be number one. Other countries aren't our problem. If it becomes our problem because they attack us, then we glass them. We hit them hard. We do things to them that have never been done before. It sounds all right to me, it's tough to have a problem with that, people sometimes think that Trump's actions while in office were just a continuation of the establishment's attitudes about these conflicts because they don't understand the finer details, which, again, we're going to get into in a separate video if you want, pertaining to his first administration, the mechanics of that. But the reality is just that Trump's actions are a continuation of Trump's attitudes about these conflicts. And he was able to quite successfully break free from these sort of establishment attitudes during his first administration. And there were several instances, as there are to this day, where you can observe this bizarre alliance between the neocon GOP establishment types and the asset right, who tries to flank Trump from the right, LOL. And so you'll see Trump has a solid trajectory on these things generally, and then one day he says one thing that's maybe a bit hawkish. And then both the neocons and the asset right will amplify it. You'll turn on Fox News and it's Trump to turn Iran into a parking lot in 5 minutes. And then you go on Twitter and it's Zion Don at it again. And then, of course, nothing happens. But both of these groups have very cynical incentives to do this, which ultimately harms the president and his movement, which they know because at the end of the day, they both want to return to the pre-Trump era for different reasons. So we need a little bit of background on this to have the conversation properly, what it was like pre-Trump, because people actually thought we could nation build. They thought we could export democracy to the rest of the world. That was our grand 21st century ambition. They thought we would be greeted as liberators by these people, which of course was not the case. And I know I sound insane right now, but people actually believed this. And hopefully, as things continue, we'll look back on a lot of the pre-Trump GOP median attitudes and think the same thing, which is that they are insane people, which again is why foreign policy is a perfect wedge to cement these correct attitudes pertaining to immigration as well, because Trump's attitude is that you cannot export American values to the rest of the world, which fits perfectly with his attitude on immigration, which is that you cannot import the rest of the world into America and expect them to be compatible. He literally talks about poisoning the blood of the nation. So that correct understanding of people and cultures is driving all of his beliefs. It all flows downstream from that. And people are starting to understand that he's correct. And they're starting to get excited about a future again, a future where Americans are once again at the helm of their own destiny. Immigration, of course, being another issue where you would be blacklisted by the movement for expressing skepticism. Yeah, a little bit of movement history, a little bit of movement history. You have to do it. You can't understand what's going on now if you don't understand what was going on then. You can't reliably predict the future without knowing this background information. You need to have the background information. Otherwise, you'll have nothing to fall back on, and you're just going to be strung around in different directions by people who have monetized your attention span, or lack thereof, rather, because, you have to understand. You have to understand how incredible it is that Donald Trump could enter into that coliseum, that establishment, and basically wrestle it to make it his own, to bend it to his will, to where now his attitudes and his vision are predominant in the GOP. And even in his first term, which is fashionable to lament in terms of his accomplishments, okay, dude, he was still able to accomplish his primary foreign policy objectives, which few give him credit for. And those were, 1, crush ISIS to remove obvious justification for continued presence in the Middle East. 2, reduce the overall presence in the Middle East. And 3, stop the regime change program against Assad in Syria, which has been sought virtually since Assad took power at the beginning of the century. And if you've been following the news, you'll see what happens when you get your post-Trump foreign policy. Assad is now out of power and Syrian Christians are just lambs to the slaughter. Again, people see Trump taking photos with Orthodox Jews and they're like, oh, Trump is compromised. He's going to start new wars. Let's vote for Democrats instead because Ilhan Omar and AOC are based anti-Zionists. Anti-white? I'm not white. Who cares? And then when Trump is in office and he ends the Washington-Israeli regime change program against Assad, starts no new wars, reduces our presence in the Middle East, delivers only symbolic victories to Israel, like what, relocating an embassy? But now Democrats are in office and everything is back to business as usual. Because unlike Trump, they have no political agency. They can't choose to act a certain way. And again, we're going to talk all about this more in future installments, but I had to hear all about how Trump is the Iran war candidate, even though ignoring how these people said the same thing in 2016 and it didn't happen. And now his rhetoric towards Iran is far more balanced than it was in 2016. He's saying now that he wants to see them succeed. He wants to make a deal. Kamala is saying they're like our greatest enemy, but Trump is the Iran war candidate. Okay. And now you have Assad being removed from power before Trump can even get back into office. So clearly the foreign policy establishment has learned that they can't control Trump. And the online right has still not learned this because they're NPCs. So yes, Trump, you have to give him credit because it was literally thought to be over. Before June 2015, everybody thought it was wraps for America. It was over. It's done. There's no more pain. Before Donald Trump's announcement speech in 2015, the right was so black-pilled, so without direction, that it began, perhaps understandably, flirting with this like post-American identity altogether, saying America's doomed, we have to look for answers in Europe because there's no path forward in America. And this is partially why you were seeing so many edits of like statues and these old European aesthetics being made into edits at the time and still recycled today, because there were attempts to construct this sort of like pan-European identity since the American cause was thought to just be completely lost. And then Donald Trump literally just shows up out of nowhere and proves that American nationalism is possible and it actually works. He ran and won on a nationalist platform. So as much as people want to rewrite it to make it about populism or whatever defanged ism they choose, no, it's always been about American identity. It was about American identity on June 16th, 2015, and it remains so today. And it's only reasserted itself as such throughout all the gay ops against it. But you do have to understand why people were so black-pilled at the time. Like imagine yourself in 2015. Pat Buchanan had failed. Ron Paul had failed. Conservatives were still getting purged for not being enthusiastically supportive of these wars and of mass immigration. And there were no openings. There were no opportunities. It seemed like all hope was lost. And so you're just kind of preparing yourself to like throw your support behind Rand Paul, hope he ends up getting a job in the Jeb Bush administration, even though you're pretty sure Clinton's going to win anyway. Until this like truly sort of miraculous coalescing of factors occurs, where now, by the grace of God, the mainstream right was actually being challenged from the right. And it had to be, for the first time in its existence, held to answer for its failures and for its mediocrity. Because the mainstream right was perfectly happy to continue with this like Bush-era patriotism and civic nationalism. They never thought they would actually have to be challenged from the right. But Trump was able to do this because he couldn't be gatekept. He couldn't be purged. He's already a beloved household name. He's a wealthy, self-funded cultural icon. So he was somehow able to channel this energy that had built up online from the Ron Paul campaigns, from Gamergate, from these obscure anonymous forums shifting and adapting to Twitter, etc., to now literally bully these people, left and right, into exposing how much hatred they have for normal Americans. And now it can't be unseen. It cannot be undone. Things have changed forever. It's one thing when you're getting called heartless or racist by some libtard. That's okay. That's part of it for you. But what happens when 100 accounts with anime profile pictures are calling you a cuck? They're calling you gay. It's an uncontrolled environment. It's the frontier. It breaks your mind. I remember seeing tweets during the 2016 cycle from these, respectable conservative pundit types. Trump would perform well in a poll or in a caucus or something, and they couldn't help themselves but tweet something out like, glad they could stop taking opiates long enough to show support. And it's like, hey, buddy, are you okay? Are you all right? Like, they couldn't help themselves. And the ones who survived, though few in number, still to this day, they do this. If you listen closely, if you have a trained ear, even though they try to blend in as pro-Trump or at least not anti-Trump, they're anti-Trump. Because they hate you and they want to go back to how things were before Trump when they got to play the part of the villain without any of the associated costs, until a real villain arrived on the scene in a red hat. The last 10 years have been spent by these people trying to put whatever that is back in the box, but they can't. Americans have decided that these people should be out of the job, and it's only a matter of time before they are. And if not for him, if not for Trump, we would have been running another NeoCon against the Tim Kaine ticket, and we would have lost bigly. So you have to count your blessings. Thank you, President Trump. There was no solution. It was over. There was no path forward until Donald Trump. Imagine the ticket you would have had to force yourself to get excited about in 2024 had Trump not carved out the path. Imagine how many more people whose support we need would have just checked out of politics altogether. So as bad as people want to say it is right now, things are getting better. You want to get dragged around by the nose like a bull by these engagement farmers. Things are getting better. Zoom out. Look at the trend. Look at the 5-year trend, the 10-year trend. Things are looking very promising for patriots, but people want a black pill, say it's over. We just have to wait for an opportunity. It's right now. It was handed to you on a golden escalator. We've never had more opportunity than we do right now to move things in the right direction, to create opportunities for the future, to keep things moving in the right direction. And people are blackpilling because, again, they have a personal incentive to see everything fail. May I remind you that we are in the White House. In more ways than would be responsible to elaborate on, the madman did it. And if there's one establishment that you can't, go against the grain on, most people would say it's the foreign policy establishment. Well, Trump managed to do this. And of course, he made a lot of enemies in the process. I mean, why do you think they tried so hard to keep him out of office? Why do you think they made his life hell while he was in office? The Tax Cuts and Jobs Act? Buddy. So in conclusion, we kind of have a sense of how things are now. I wanted to remind everyone how things were before Trump, before he single-handedly changed the way our country and GOP voters experienced foreign policy, what the options were, what the stakes were, what the consequences were for not falling in line. So let me know if you'd like to continue this discussion and get into the actual mechanics of the first Trump administration, go through the timeline of how he actually managed to wrestle day by day with these people to complete his objectives and deliver for the American public. And from there, perhaps we can extrapolate into the present situation globally, make some predictions about what the second Trump administration is going to look like. All right, I'll see you in the smaller screen. Hey guys, John Doyle up here live reporting to you from the smaller screen as promised. Promises made, promises kept, of course. If you like this video, leave it a thumbs up. It'll let me know that you want to continue this discussion about the mechanics of Trump foreign policy, all of that. I wanted to break it up. This was just our sort of intro, what it was like before, setting the stage of, when we did the Indiana Jones switch, with the idle sandbag thing, whatever. Like that. Like that freaking Hollywood movie. And then also leave a comment to let me know specifically what you liked or disliked. Just leave the comment. And then if you disliked the video, I won't know that you disliked it because I don't read that number because it makes me sad. So your only way to express your unhappiness with the video would be to leave a comment. So that's your avenue for that. And then also go ahead and subscribe so that you can hate watch or love watch future content. It's all the same to me, number on screen secretes the dopamine or whatever. It's my reward circuitry activating. And then go ahead and share the video with a friend also. And then like, comment, subscribe. Turn on notifications because, again, we might be making more of these. Who knows? But yes, thank you so much for watching. May God bless America. Pray for the Syrian Christians. Pray for a lot of people, but I mean, I guess them in particular. Sort of evil, the timing of that, isn't it? So maybe we'll talk more about it. All right. Have a good day. Love you. God bless you. Bye-bye.